Welcome to Supply Chain Wisdom. I'm your host, Professor Nick Vyas, founding executive director for Kendrick Global Supply Chain Management Institute, Marshall School of Business, University of Southern California. We have an amazing guest that is going to help us take a deeper dive into the concept of agility. COVID has taught us that supply chains, at best, are marginal when it comes to sustainability, resiliency, and agility. Aubrey brings an incredible years of experience as an entrepreneur. His perspective may not be directly related to supply chain industry, but his experiences over the years will bring an incredible opportunity to understand the industry collaboration and how agility in supply chains can be viewed, and what are the best practices that can be learned. Aubrey, welcome, and thanks for joining us. And thanks for being part of our executive committee at the Institute.
Thanks so much, Nick. It's a real honor to be on your executive committee and to work with you and others on the big issues of the industry. But I've got a question for you, Nick. It seems to me that much of the supply chain agility conversation focuses on individual supply chain rather than the broader issues of industry supply chain agility.
Aubrey, that's a great perspective, that how does the collaboration, not only within the supply chain, but outside the supply chain as the holistic ecosystems, if you will, that we should think about and look at it. And what would that look like? So let me ask this question to you. Can you share your perspective about industry types of collaboration outside of global supply chain industry? So give us some specific examples, Aubrey, based on your experience. How does other industry looks at agility and collaboration?
Sure. Well, in the cybersecurity industry, there's an area called cybersecurity threat sharing. And we've been enabling threat sharing for over 10 years in different communities, such as the top 100 defense contractors, the top automotive companies, top companies in Canada. So these are examples, again, in the cyber industry of where collaboration and threat sharing are taking place today.
That's interesting, Aubrey. So your extensive background in software, to mention specific Kendall Corporation, which you grew and sold it to IBM in 2000. So you have an insight about the agility when it relates to business and software.
Yes. Software from a high conceptual level, software is like a lubricant for companies' business processes, business automation, and business agility. Just like oil is a lubricant for your car. But as you know, Nick, if you don't change the oil in the car, the oil turns to sludge and the engine can freeze. So software can be similar. There's a period of time when software is this lubricant, but over time, as the software application projects grow, add more functions, complexity, sometimes built with spaghetti code, software can accumulate to become like cholesterol, software cholesterol that clogs down the corporate process arteries. And that could start to slow down a company's agility. So the insight here is there's a half-life of time of when software can be an enabler and improve business agility until it starts to turn around and then slows down business agility.
I like the analogy that you use about the cholesterol, because we teach in our graduate global supply chain program, the supply chain industry really is about removing the friction, because the friction in a supply chain industry considered as a byproduct of heat and resistance that creates inefficient outputs. So it's a brilliant how you think about the cholesterol and what we think about the friction in supply chain. I think the software in supply chain certainly sort of works in that parallel concept.
I know in the supply chain area, there are discussions about China decoupling. And I know, Nick, you and Jeff Weiss from Steptoe wrote a paper in Bloomberg that says decoupling from China is not the same as deglobalization. So there's kind of a continuation of decoupling concepts. It's the same in software. Software involves a range of coupling from old school tight coupling with hardwired software, which results in brittle systems, to the other ranges where you have loosely coupled technologies, one of which is blockchain, that can enable more business and application agility.
Well said, Aubrey. So the purpose of our audience to understand, do you have any practical example of how to improve agility in software? So give us some specific detail.
Well, one example involves blockchain. I created the Security Token Academy a few years ago. Security tokens are built on blockchain, and they can enable this loose coupling mechanism, especially in the global financial services industry.
So, Aubrey, I understand the Security Token Academy, where you talked about 3 waves of new financial internet. That's a fascinating term, all built on blockchain. What were those 3 waves? I'm so curious to understand more about it.
It's absolutely essential that in the global financial industry, Nick, that they accelerate their agility. And here are 3 different phases or waves of the agility that I see in that industry. The first wave was about payments, which is a simple mechanism built on the basic blockchain level. You know what payments are. You see something online, you want to buy a camera, you have a digital wallet, you pay for it, and that's payments. It comes from, of course, underlying technologies. The second wave is a little more complex. It's where people wanted to invest in different companies using blockchain through a technology and a process called ICOs, initial coin offerings. But there were problems with this wave because there were regulatory issues with the SEC and other regulators around the world. And so many of these investing initiatives in phase 2 or wave 2 were shut down. The third wave is about addressing the regulatory issues, dealing with the international regulatory requirements relating to KYC, know your customer, and AML, anti-money laundering. And it's this third wave that leverages the security tokens to enable the decoupling that I talked about a few minutes ago, Nick.
Fascinating. So there are lessons from both the blockchain and the security token experiences that you talked about in this 3-wave in a new generation internet. There are agility lessons that can be learned into the supply chain industries. Am I right?
So definitely, in the area of global investing, cross-border trading has a lot of administrative friction that can impact investment liquidity. And this friction occurs because many countries have different ways of defining their own KYC and AML rules, know your customer and anti-money laundering rules. Now, the classic way to try and address this, Nick, is to standardize the regulatory rules across countries through something called harmonization. But the problem with this is countries are sovereign entities, and they don't necessarily want to homogenize their specific rules along the lines of an international collective. So how can decoupling via security tokens address this issue? Well, the answer is instead of hardwiring the rules of KYC and AML for each of these countries, these rules can be defined in a non-programmatic way through tables, for example, via security tokens. And the benefit is that if you have investors from, say, 5 different countries, the security tokens could dynamically flex and adapt to the local KYC and AML rules of each of the countries.
That's phenomenal. So, Aubrey, as you know, I have written substantially about the decouplings of supply chain long before even the COVID started. But often, even now, I think in the tail end of our COVID experiences, I still get asked this question. What is the decoupling, right? Nick, I know we read about everything you've written on this, but it looks very conceptual. So can you, Aubrey, from your vantage point and your knowledge of the years that you've been as an entrepreneur, tell us exactly, how do you see this decoupling and in a more real world perspective?
Of course, for some people, Nick, decoupling is a little bit of a mystery. So here's an example in terms of the global financial industry for commercial real estate projects that want to attract large, say, family offices, investors from different countries around the world, and how this adaptive technology can remove some of the administrative friction. So from an industry point of view, this could be really a game changer, Nick, by changing and shifting the approach from regulatory harmonization to something I call regulatory interoperability. Additionally, since different countries are endlessly changing their rules about KYC and AML and other things, you can see the power of decoupling by having security tokens having a tremendous benefit to ongoing global finance agility.
So that would be certainly benefit to the real estate project that you used as an example.
Exactly. In the financial investment industry, the bottom line benefit here is liquidity. In the commercial real estate area, investors are not wanting to be locked into long-term deals, which can reduce liquidity. So one aspect of cross-border liquidity can be improved through decoupling, and greater liquidity is certainly attractive to investors.
Thanks, Aubrey. Fascinating. So let me set the stage here. COVID has taught one thing to the humanity. And when I say humanity, I literally mean the humanity. Disruption over 170 countries, every continent imaginable, every civilization, irrespective of their financial status, advancements in technology, every community, every local municipality has faced some impact of COVID disruptions of supply chain. Right? You talked about some fascinating insight about the agility from the software side. Let's actually draw some parallel. How do you see some of the learnings that you talked about from agility on the software industry that can be applied to this broader supply chain industry, so the disruptions that we have experienced in this current pandemic of the century can be avoided in the future? And it all could be geopolitical, another pandemic, or some natural disaster. What we learn, and can you apply that into the broader sense of global supply chain management?
Yes, so we are researching this aspect of agility, Nick, not just for individual supply chains, but as I said, for the global supply chain industry agility. And it's my sense that the complex global supply chain industry does not yet have an efficient way for the various corners of the industry to communicate and collaborate with each other. So I think there's a need to have a technical foundation that can flex and better enable industry agility for the massive industry disruptions that are occurring today. And I also think, Nick, we need to be better prepared to deal with future disruptions and shocks.
And so I was just going to ask you, so what different areas do you think that needs to be addressed in supply chain? I know it's a complex space, but if you were to pick two or three, where do you see your focus would be?
I think there could be two different areas that could improve agility in this global supply chain industry. One is to provide a mechanism for longer-term strategic collaboration and planning across the different corners of the industry. But the second area, and frankly, a little bit more interesting to myself, is to understand how the broader industry responds to industry shocks on a tactical and on an operational basis. And for this, I think there needs to be some type of hub or network to enable tactical coordination relating to the current supply chain disruptions. But Nick, I think a key issue here in the industry, in my opinion, is really about the agility needed for future industry disruptions. So especially, for example, industry shocks that could relate to China taking over Taiwan over the next few years, or who knows, over the next few months.
And Aubrey, well said, because I'm taking about half a dozen to a dozen calls a week.
Wow.
From Fortune 500 executives that they are actually having this conversation. They're concerned about some of these geopolitical shocks, as you would call future shocks, and what would that mean to their supply chain network. So you're right. I think there is certainly a legit concerns globally about the future state of resiliency in our global supply chain networks. So we have a follow-up question. So let's talk about the characterization of the type of hub or the network. So when we talk about these networks and systems we talked about, explain, how do you see the different networks and the types of it?
Well, this is really amazing. A dozen or so calls a week. This is quite phenomenal, Nick. Regarding my thoughts and direction, I see this direction as really a supply chain global agility network. Now, this is not the epic digitization process that tries to replace the 80-year-old fixation and dependency on paper technology. That's really a great essential project, but it's also a massive project, almost a boil the ocean type of project. So what we are working on is to improve, perhaps in the 2022 time period, a way to improve industry agility and resilience in the face of both current and future industry shocks and disruptions.
As we move to the future state of supply chain, which is a digital supply chain, what keeps me awake at night is not somebody disrupting our physical supply chain, but rather this digital supply chains of the future. You have tremendous insight and expertise on cybersecurity. I want you to bring your wisdom from that cybersecurity space of the software into our world of supply chain. How do you see the ransomware and cybersecurity implications on our supply chain areas? Because that's the one thing keeps me awake at night.
Nick, you're right. Ransomware is an important threat, not only in the current physical, but also in the future digital supply chain area. And I assume for many of the large individual primes and OEMs, they've got a great IT organization, a CISO, Chief Information Security Officer, that have really nailed down the internal ransomware readiness programs. But supply chain executives need to be concerned also outside their organization, on their suppliers, on third-party risk management. Now, the odds of a successful ransomware attack against some of their strategic and mid-tier suppliers is growing quickly. And so as a result, primes need to go beyond the historical annual procurement checklist approach and work on how to improve ransomware readiness for their key suppliers. And one of our directions is to really help supply chain executives, not so much IT, help them improve the readiness of their core suppliers from a ransomware point of view.
Well stated, Aubrey. Thank you. So to our listeners, you may, if you're not scared already with the disruption the COVID posed, hopefully our discussion today with Aubrey does not depress you further. Intent here, the supply chain wisdom is truly to enlighten the perspectives, the views, bring some of the core knowledge in parallel industries and best practices to broaden our horizon scan. Aubrey, thank you so very much. I want to give you a last reflective comment about this whole topic of agility and opportunity in supply chain. Your last words.
I think, Nick, you and I are both concerned about the current and future disruptions in the supply chain from a broad ecosystem point of view. And I think building industry-level agility is essential, but of course it's a massively complex undertaking, which is why it appeals to me, by the way. So as we work on these possible solutions, we're creating an executive advisory committee to provide us with more tangible insights and guidance. And we hope to announce some key industry participants in the near future, Nick.
And Aubrey, well said, it's real. So thank you so very much for an incredible amount of energy that you bring from your expertise into the supply chain industries, because we need that. And thank you for your support. Thanks for being part of the Institute Executive Committee. And I look forward to continuing to work with you in this great frontier. Thank you.
Nick, thank you very much.